You're listening to the Bitcoin Lawyer Podcast.
Hey, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of the Bitcoin Lawyer Podcast, your legal bridge between Bitcoin and freedom. Today, I am joined by Jimmy Song, author and Bitcoiner, speaker as well. Jimmy, thanks for being on the show.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So, Jimmy, this show, we normally talk about citizenship by investment and Bitcoin as a crossroads, if you will. Today's episode will be a little different. The last episode we did was a YouTuber by the name of Hobbyist Miner, and he promotes Bitcoin mining at home. So, maybe we can just start there with your background, how you got into Bitcoin, and what that looked like. Just kind of give us maybe just a brief timeline, how you got into Bitcoin and your journey in the BTC world up until now.
Yeah, I mean it's a long story, I guess, but I've been a coder most of my life. Started when I was 9, so right out of college. I saw Bitcoin in 2011, working at another startup, and I saw a story on Slash that said internet only currency Bitcoin reaches dollar parity. And I didn't know anything about it. That was my first exposure. This was February of 2011. And you can still go see that story on slashdot.org. And you can tell it was old because it had they spelled Bitcoin with a big B and a big C, camel case.
Oh, really? Was that the original spelling of it?
No, I don't think the editors really knew what it was, so
Oh,
they just sort of spelled it. But anyway, that was back in 2011. I got more into it in 2013 with the bull market. I started contributing to some Bitcoin-based open source projects, and I got into the space as a coder for from 2013, particularly up until 2017, I worked for different Bitcoin companies, and then I started teaching classes. I went off on my own and started teaching developers about Bitcoin and what the protocol was, which eventually led to my first book, Programming Bitcoin, which was published with O'Reilly. And since then, I've been, I guess, an influencer or something. I've been doing podcasts like this, speaking engagements and things like that. I still code. I still, write a lot. And yeah, that's basically what I do at this point.
yeah, I was going to tell you, I didn't mention this before we started recording, but I actually came up to you at the Plan B forum in El Salvador
Mm.
back in January. You were in the conference room, and I was there, and I saw you, and I saw the cowboy hat, and I was like, oh, I bet that's Jimmy Song. And I just kind of walked up. I'm like, are you Jimmy Song? You looked, and you were kind of in like in the middle of something by yourself
Uh-huh.
on your computer, and looked up. You're like, yeah, like obviously. And I'm like, okay, just want to say big fan of your work, and walked away. I'm sure you get approached like that all the time, but just wanted to say that I saw the speech that you gave at that conference, and that was one of the reason of many why I wanted to have you on the podcast. But yeah, anyways. So you started coding, you got into Bitcoin. What was it originally about Bitcoin that kind of drew you in? Because what I really find is a lot of people come to Bitcoin from different fractions, right? We can get into that, and that's a whole other topic. Like, sort of these other Bitcoin fractions, I guess you could call, where people sort of align themselves with different groups, different ideologies. When you came to Bitcoin, or when you first discovered it, what attracted you to it? Did you see it as more of a coding opportunity, or what was it that intrigued you about the concept of Bitcoin?
Yeah, and I think what you're hitting on is something that we've seen from the very beginning. There's a bunch of technical people that get into it because it's interesting, technically speaking, and then there are the economics people that get into it because they find it economically interesting. And I have to say I'm a little bit of both on that, and I'm very fortunate to have had exposure to the right ideas beforehand to be able to appreciate it. There's the technical aspect, obviously. There's an internet only money. That was very interesting to me, just based on that. But there's also the economic aspect, and that I think 2008 very much radicalized me, and I was prepared to receive something like that just because of how big the bailouts were, and I was working at the time, and just the numbers were absolutely nuts. So for me, it was a little bit of both. Finding out about the 21 million limit at the beginning was like that brought out sort of like the economic cryosity, but
Mhm.
also the technical aspect of it. I had a rough idea of how it might work just based on my knowledge of public key cryptography and things.
Mhm.
Which, by the way, like a lot of coders don't actually know that much about. I was also fortunate there because I majored in math in college, so I had some rough idea of how public key cryptography worked. And I didn't really study it until like 2003 and so on. But that's where all of that sort of came in.
Yeah, it's just from hearing what you said. I mean, that just definitely sounds like a perfect storm of someone who would, coming from a mathematical background, programming background, why Bitcoin would be such an attractive option. And who knew at that time, when everything first started, that you could even make a career out of it. So,
Mm.
that's really interesting. I'm always curious to hear about when people came to Bitcoin, what was sort of their journey, and, kind of where they are now. I did maybe kind of want to touch on what were some of the problems that you saw that maybe Bitcoin, because I know that at least I've heard, and I'm not sure if this is attributed to you. Correct me if I'm wrong, but the phrase Bitcoin fixes that. I mean, am I correct?
I mean, I didn't invent it. I heard it from somewhere else. It's just the name of my podcast now. But yeah, but there is definitely this sense that Bitcoin like touches on a lot of stuff that you wouldn't otherwise think of. And actually, that's what wrote about in my latest book, Fiat Ruins Everything. It's not so much that Bitcoin is this holy water that you can sprinkle on anything and make into like something awesome. It's just that removing fiat money from the equation is actually like it changes in a lot of incentives and make things in civilization a lot better. So that's ultimately I think what's happening with Bitcoin is that once you get back to sound money, we used to be on sound money, we aren't anymore. I think especially since advent of the Federal Reserve in 1913, the Nixon shock in 1971, those two events were pretty devastating, I think, for civilization in many ways. But the Bitcoin is bringing a lot of that back, and that's where my interests have sort of evolved, thinking about all of that stuff and how the incentives actually play out in a fiat economy. I write a lot about like rent seekers, for example, people that don't really do anything but like collect a paycheck, like giving permission for some transaction or something like that. And we're discovering through a lot of the stuff that Elon Musk is doing and so on that there's a lot of that. There's not just in government, but probably in most companies and most organizations of any size,
Yeah.
there's a lot of people that don't do anything that's valuable.
That's very true. Just to hit on what you said, I actually spent 12 years as a federal civil servant between
Mm,
DC and a field office in New York. So I can speak from personal experience that just sort of the term they use, fraud, waste, and abuse within the
mm,
government, of just how prevalent those things are. And when you're working for the largest employer in the country, the US federal government, and when you're backed by the world reserve currency, there's not a whole lot of accountability and not a whole lot of incentive to try to be good stewards. Yes, that was the term that I was looking for. Being good stewards of the taxpayers' money. So I can definitely understand that. I did want to hit on two other things that you mentioned about, a finite supply. Obviously, I think when a lot of us first come to Bitcoin, we find out about this fixed supply, and with every halving, Bitcoin becomes more scarce, and from a mining standpoint, increased hash rate, We've always had higher difficulty, that sort of thing. I'm wondering from an economic standpoint, where do you see that maybe going in a more digital world?
Scarcity is just like so incredibly rare in a world with lots and lots of humans, and that's kind of the point, right? It's whenever you have something that people want, they figure out lots of ways to make more of it. So I'm told by my kids that the Nintendo Switch 2 is already sold out everywhere. The pre-orders, you just can't get them. And I'm sure there that on eBay you can like pay for somebody's spot in line or something like that, and I'm sure once it comes out, it's going to be like a hot seller, and it'll probably sell for double on eBay or something like that. But when you have something like that, what happens is Nintendo just makes more of the consoles, right? Like, and sells it for a nice profit margin, or actually they might even lose money on their consoles so they can make more money on games or whatever. But that's the natural state of things, is that the supply keeps up with the demand. With Bitcoin, it's very unique in the sense that there's no elasticity in the supply. It's a fixed supply, and we know exactly the schedule at which Bitcoin will come into existence. So there's not that much wiggle room on the supply side. There's a little bit if you put a lot of hashing power in, like in one difficulty adjustment period or something like that. But generally, there's we know exactly how much, and it's not going to change too much. Whereas everything else, there are people that are thinking of creative ways to get more of it. So like oil, for example, there's a lot of demand for oil, and some guy figured out that you can do horizontal drilling. Now we have fracking, and you get way more oil as a result from like the same area and stuff like that. And that's the creativity of human beings. And you're with any other commodity, you're having to like go up against that, because the creativity there's a lot of financial motivation for an in-demand commodity for people to figure out ways to go get it. Whereas with Bitcoin, there is you really, literally can't do anything. I mean, I guess you can research ways to break SHA-256 or break elliptic curve cryptography or something like that, but generally those aren't that very fruitful, because they're chosen for that reason. They're very, very secure. So yeah, that scarcity is the most important property, and that's why Bitcoin continues to go in price, up in price, because there's no elasticity on the supplies. When there's more demand, it has no escape. There's no release valve for that demand except by the price going up. That's what we've seen for 15 years, as more and more people begin understand that scarcity. In the future, as more people understand that scarcity, it'll continue going up in price, because there's, like, relatively speaking, like about 1% of the world at the most that own Bitcoin. I can't imagine it. Yeah, I mean, if as long as the adoption for as a savings vehicle keeps increasing, the price is going to keep going up.
What are necessarily your thoughts about the creation of the ETFs? I think one concern that a lot of people have is that the creation of the ETFs, I mean, to what extent are these larger investment firms sort of creating Bitcoin on paper, right? I mean, we're not
Hmm.
necessarily able to get in and audit their books, able to truly tell if these funds are one-to-one backed. What you think that does to the entire ecosystem, if that perhaps, and I'm not saying that perhaps they are or are not artificially inflating this, but just the potential that they could sort of create paper Bitcoin. What aspects or what secondary or negative effects could that have on the entire ecosystem?
Yeah, I mean, ETFs, I guess, are bigger than other entities have been, but that's essentially the case with any exchange, right? And this is why we say in Bitcoin, not your keys, not your coins. We want people to possess their own Bitcoin, because you never really know whether you actually have Bitcoin. Like, if you hold it on an exchange, you have a claim against the exchange. You don't
Mhm.
actually have the Bitcoin, and it's entirely possible that they're running a fractional reserve, like you were implying with ETFs. Now with the ETFs, like, and exchanges, there is this sort of like way to check, which is just to withdraw your Bitcoin, right? And I think for a while there, Chase Mayer had this thing called proof of keys, which was withdraw all your Bitcoins on January 3rd. from wherever you might have them. And the idea was to stress those systems to see if anybody is going on a bank run or anything like that. That's how you find out if there's a fractional reserve. Is it possible that the ETFs are doing that? I don't think the risk is any more than like exchanges, and we've had a lot of exchange blowups in the history of Bitcoin. The latest being, I guess, like FTX or something like that. But there were many, many, many others. Even back in like 2013, somebody emailed me like a list of like Bitcoin exchange failures. It was like a list that was like 20 or 30 long in 2013, right? Like, which is kind of crazy, but that's um, this is nothing new. Like fractional reserve banking and things like that. It's pernicious, but in a sense, it's self-correcting, because as soon as people get a hint that you're insolvent, then you're going to go and withdraw, like a lot of people did with FTX, and
Yeah.
show who's like swimming naked. ETFs, it's a little bit harder because they have to way more regulated, and they have to have a custodian. And from what I understand, Coinbase is the custodian, so there's some sort of audit taking place. I don't know how much in terms of fractional reserve banking that they can do. And there's also this exit. You can convert, some large tranche of those shares for some fixed amount of Bitcoins. You might be able to convert like, I don't know, 10,000 shares of IBIT and get, whatever the equivalent number of Bitcoin is. That's just generally how ETFs are structured. You have to be able to convert in and out. So, the opposite, which is like putting your Bitcoin into the ETF so you can maybe make a little bit of a premium or something like that, you can easily just kind of do. You contact the firm and you tell them how much, and they have a minimum, right? Like something like 100 Bitcoin, or I don't know, 10 Bitcoin or something like that. And at that point, then they'll give you the equivalent number of shares. A reverse process is essentially like making a run on the bank. And that's how you keep them honest. The potential for them doing that, I guess, could be like maybe at another level, but I honestly don't think so. Like when Mt. Gox went down in 2013, they had something like 60-70% of the world Bitcoin trading volume, and that was that was huge, right? Like that they had so many users and Bitcoin. So I mean, I can't see it being worse.
Yeah, that was actually something that I wanted to get into. Just talking about exchanges, sort of the evolution, and what I would say are like the big three, I would maybe call them Mt. Gox, FTX, and the most recent Bybit hack. What are your thoughts on, we can maybe come back to the ETFs. Maybe this is the libertarian in me, but just kind of being a little skeptical of BlackRock holding my Bitcoin, to me seems like the most, and like the complete antithesis of what Satoshi would have envisioned. But coming back to the collapse of those three different exchanges, just from a historical standpoint, you've been in Bitcoin longer than I have. I got in 2020 during COVID, and that's when I found it. What are your thoughts of seeing, this, as you alluded to, Mt. Gox having 60-70% of the trading volume, basically essentially a complete monopoly at that time, and these other exchanges that have failed over the years? What are maybe some of the lessons that you think Bitcoiners could learn from an evolutionary standpoint, looking at sort of lessons learned along the way from 2013 Mt. Gox up to Bybit now?
Yeah, the main lessons I think are, not your keys, not your coins, right? That self sovereignty is everything, and you don't want to keep your money on exchanges or in an ETF or anything like that. Just keep it yourself. Now, I get that a lot of people are very hesitant to possess their own property because almost everything today is a registered instrument. You go buy a stock on Fidelity, that's actually like you don't get a stock certificate like you used to in the old days. It's registered somewhere and it says you own this many, and then when you sell it, it says you no longer own it or whatever. But this is a different kind of thing. It's a bearer instrument, and you should, if you can, go and possess it yourself. The problem is most people are not confident in doing that, right? Like they're so used to registered instruments and having fallbacks and stuff like that. But ultimately that's what leads to like systemic fragility, because now everybody has the same custodian, and if the custodian goes down, now they need a bailout and so on. And this is basically what happens every, I don't know, 7 or 8 years or something like that, when you have a financial crisis of some kind. So that you don't want that. And I've been working actually on a project to help people that are sort of less confident custodying their own stuff. If you have a trusted relative, at least keep the Bitcoin with them, right? Like, they love you, know you, and stuff like that, and they're less likely to maybe screw you over than a faceless corporation or something. Like, to some degree, I don't think you're ever really going to get everybody to run their own nodes and possess their own keys, but and those people will be using BlackRock and things like that. At some point, something bad's going to happen, and they're going to learn their lesson that way, right? For a lot of people in the Depression era, that was their lesson, was that like the bank screwed them over, so they never deposited money at their bank again, because they didn't.
Hence the whole stuffing cash under the mattress, like
Right.
something like that, or burying pennies in your backyard, a jar full of coins, something like that.
Yeah, and that's what people did. I think we have to learn that lesson again, because like the fragility of the entire monetary system is not obvious to a lot of people, but it is. You can kind of feel it, right? Because you see the inflation, you see the prices going up, you see a lot of just things starting to break, as a result of higher rates or lower rates, or different trade things or whatever. It's all just sort of showing a systemic fragility. And as people discover that, the system that they've been using their whole life is, like, if it collapses, then they're going to learn a pretty harsh lesson. And the Bitcoiners are the ones that are sort of getting prepared for it, and kind of have a good idea of what to do beforehand. And yeah, I mean, it's only the paranoid survive. Bitcoiners, you can call us paranoid, but that's how you make it.
You mentioned a few economic issues there, so let's dive into that. Given the new administration coming in and the new approach with tariffs, let's just take that for example, right? You're starting to see, if you look at exchange rates, the dollar is starting to slowly decline against global currencies, not just major, but globally. I'm curious, because we haven't had anything like 2007, 2008, the financial crisis, right? We haven't had anything of that volume since Bitcoin came about in 2009. If we were to have, let's just say, God forbid, but a sort of global contraction of, economic prosperity, whether it be, by, well, hell, the definition of a recession used to be, 2 quarters of negative earnings, and that was the definition of a recession. That globally that definition has changed. Where would you see Bitcoin taking a place if we were to have something equal to the global recession nowadays? Would you see mass adoption of Bitcoin, or do you think we would see greater price increase? Or from an economic standpoint, how do you see that playing out?
Yeah, it's always tricky to try to predict price or how these things play out. Like tariffs, for example, for a lot of the people on the right, it's a national security issue, because you're getting too many military parts from China and things like that, and especially if you're going to be opposing them in some way over the next 50 years, which I think is going to happen in some way, shape, or form, then you can't depend on them. So, like, it's not just economic. There's a lot of other considerations, and the thing about predicting Bitcoin price is that it's difficult without the part of the equation that you don't know, right? You know the supply of Bitcoin, that's very easy. You don't know necessarily the demand, because if you have tighter monetary policy, then people will generally hold the dollar a little bit more. And we've had that for like the last 3 years or so, with higher interest rates on government bonds and so on. So like a company like Tether makes billions and billions of dollars because they use short-term treasuries to get 4 or 5% on their money. And that, when you have like 100 billion under management, that's like $4 or $5 billion. That ends up being extremely, extremely profitable. But that, I mean, we have had some level of at least monetary contraction, and that was largely due to the overspending during COVID. There were stimmy checks going out to a lot of people, and the PPP loans and things like that. It massively inflated the monetary supply.
If I can just interject, well, I worked at DHS for my last job before I left the government in 2023, and I was working for Homeland Security Investigations, which is basically the investigative arm of DHS. And I would get these criminal reports that would come across my desk. I was working as a writer editor, so basically reading these reports and then cleaning up grammar, research, that sort of thing before sending them on to our director for approval. But all of these PP loans, I cannot tell you how many billions of dollars that people scammed the government. And when you look at how creative people got and not creative because of just how easy they were to obtain during that period, it's insane of just how the level of fraud that because of how easy the administration in power at that time made it, how accessible they made those funds. So I mean, yeah, just to hit on that topic, absolutely.
Yeah, and that created a lot of lot of inflation. I think we're still seeing a lot of that now. It's kind of lagging because the money has to sort of go into the economy and so on. But yeah, it's difficult to figure out exactly how the demand is going to change based on policy, because like, for example, tariffs. What a lot of what's happening with the dollar, the weakening of the dollar, like you mentioned, is because the governments that own these treasuries have to sell them into the market to keep funding like a lot of these businesses that are that can't sell as much to the US and so on. So there's a lot of different dynamics at play. Over the long term, it's a little bit easier to predict, like, okay, what happens if China sells all their US treasuries or something like that. It's a little bit easier, but over the short term, it's very hard to predict, because there are just so many variables at play with respect to demand. I think the Trump administration actually likes a weaker dollar at this moment, just mostly because that means that U.S. goods are cheaper elsewhere, and exporting is something that one of the goals of the whole tariff policy is to balance trade. And if you're going to do that, then you want a weaker dollar so you can sell your goods cheaper in other countries. So that may be what's happening. It's like, again, like macro politics stuff. Generally, there's a lot of different factors at play, but the general trend is that they print more money, and ultimately that's good for Bitcoin.
Yeah, absolutely. I actually hadn't thought about the reasoning for a weaker dollar, but that actually, if you're thinking about imposing more tariffs, obviously on imports, it does make sense to sort of counterbalance that with a larger export quota or a larger export amount. From an economic standpoint, that actually makes perfect sense. I hadn't thought about that. If we could turn back to Bitcoin and I just wanted to get a little bit more into your personal background, if we could. I know you had mentioned you've written a few books, you've coded. What do you think if someone was getting into the Bitcoin scene now? Where would be a good place for them to start? Do you think maybe trying to approach it from a particular angle, like trying to get into the coding side or maybe the startup side? Because we've seen God knows how many different kinds of businesses that have been started on top of Bitcoin. And you're like, okay, well, I hadn't thought about that use case for it. I don't know if you maybe have any thoughts about where someone first coming to Bitcoin, where they might start, or just given the landscape of the current bull market, where would someone maybe want to start or kind of get their feet wet in the industry?
Yeah, it depends on the person, right? Obviously, and if you're a coder, yeah, go learn the coding stuff. If you're an
Sure.
economist, go learn the economic stuff. If you're like a
Mhm.
marketer, go learn the marketing stuff. If you're a UI UX expert, then go learn that stuff. Like it's and that's assuming you even want a job in the Bitcoin industry. I
Mhm.
can tell you it's not really that easy a road.
Okay.
There's a lot of people that want to get into Bitcoin, think, okay, well, this is something that I'm passionate about. But vast majority of the time, you're going to be able to make more money in the normal fiat world and then go stack sats that way. I wrote this tweet the other day that the most impactful thing that you're probably going to be able to do in Bitcoin is stacking sats, right? Like saving in Bitcoin. That's probably the most impactful thing that you're going to be able to do. You don't need to necessarily contribute to the Bitcoin core repository or join a Bitcoin company or anything like that. I mean, if you want to, great, and if you have the skills, even better. But that's not something that's like required of you. If you don't understand Bitcoin yet, I like, depending on who you are, I have different book recommendations and so on, and there's tons of that to go around. But for a lot of people, like, they feel like they're trying to get into Bitcoin because it's their passion, and
Sure.
oftentimes that's not the right move. What you want to do right now, especially with Bitcoin, is stack a lot of sats. And I don't know, like, this is a trade-off that you have to make personally. What makes you happy versus what makes you happy later. Like that's whether you're willing to do certain jobs or if you want to go do something else. That's a very personal question, and it varies depending on who you are and what skills you have.
Yeah. Is there any one book? There's many different books that not only just sort of chronicle the history of Bitcoin, but offer different takes. If you just had to name one book, if there's an author or a particular book, who would you maybe point someone to who's just getting into Bitcoin?
I would probably get them started on the Bitcoin Standard.
Okay.
That's worked for a lot of people. It's one of the best reviewed Bitcoin books on Amazon and so on. Depending on like exactly what angle you're coming in from, there are other
Mhm.
books that might be more appropriate. I have a book, Thank God for Bitcoin, that I wrote specifically for Christians. And if you're a Christian and kind of skeptical about this whole thing, I think that's a good book. Again, depends on who you are, what your goals are, what your values are, and why you want to understand Bitcoin. There's a lot of different resources that will help you depending on where you are. Yeah, I would say use that rather than like a single book that everyone has to read. I'm not really for one size fits all solutions. We have lots of different books in Bitcoin for a reason. They all speak to a different audience, and yeah, depending on what member of what audience you are, to go read that.
Yeah, if we go back in the day, if you were in the big blocker tribe or, the
Mm.
smaller block tribe, that whole thing, definitely different fractions and different avenues to take. I'm curious, have you ever really gotten involved in Bitcoin mining? Like you talked about the coding, but I'm just curious what experience or if any, if you've had with Bitcoin mining.
Yeah, I mean, I back in 2014, I bought a couple of Antminer S1s. This was
Oh,
like the very
cool.
the original Antminer. And this was way back when ASICs were still fairly new. So the first ASICs came out, I think, in 2013. And they were just like destroying the hash rate of anything else that came before it. I think
Mhm.
FPGAs were doing really well, but then the ASICs came and just they were able to like solo mine almost. But then there were lots of other ASIC manufacturers at the time, TerraMiner, Butterfly Labs, and they weren't serious projects. They screwed over a lot of people. And in a sense, like when Antminer came along, this was from Bitmain, obviously. What was surprising was the conference I went to was 2014. It was the Texas Bitcoin conference, and they had the units like there. Like you could just like go buy it, right? Like cost like a Bitcoin or something like that, and This was when it was like a few $100s. So you could just like go buy it. Every other manufacturer required like 4 to 6 months of lead time, and you had to put in the deposit in Bitcoin, and then you would get it at the end of it. And so I bought a couple of them at that conference, and I think I ran it long enough to make a slight profit, and then I sold them on eBay right afterwards. So, and the reason I did that was because they were really loud, and my wife did not want to have them in the house because she was like, yeah, it's making that room really hot, stuff like
Yeah.
that. So that's the extent of my like actual mining. I've done some deep dives on like the mining industry and how it all works with different lithography processes, and the actual chips and the yield that a lot of them get, and why they all go to TSMC. But yeah, I mean that's the extent of it. I haven't really mined since then, although I do have a bid axe, so I should probably plug it in at some point. But yeah.
You should always be solo mining if you've got one of those laying around.
Yeah, I should. I think it can definitely be like a fun way to like participate and maybe mine something, right? And if you do, then it's like a jackpot. Basically, it's a perpetual lottery, basically.
Absolutely. I mean, we're at 3.125 BTC. If you hit the blocks, I mean, might as well just roll the dice on that. No one's going to turn that down these days. Yeah, so talking about mining, talking about coding, if we look at the profile of your average Bitcoiner, Bitcoiners come from many different walks of life. And I know from your history, you speak at a lot of different conferences. So you probably meet a lot of different types of profiles. What do you think is one unique thing that brings all people together under Bitcoin? Maybe aside from not the obvious reasons that one might think of, whether it be like economic or political, perhaps, but maybe these sort of like subtle underlying tones that wouldn't be so apparent to someone at first glance.
Yeah, I've not just spoken at a lot of Bitcoin conferences, but I've met a lot of different Bitcoiners around the world at their native meetups or whatever. So I've spoken at like the meetup in Istanbul and like Kuala Lumpur and Taipei and places like that. So there's the thing that I find in common with all of these Bitcoiners is that they are generally very liberty minded and are open to learning things in a new way, right? So we're all taught sort of like conventional wisdom about X, Y, or Z. Bitcoiners are the ones that are much more likely to question those and like just ask, hey, like, could this be different? So oftentimes when I like go out to dinner with a lot of these Bitcoiners at these conferences or after these meetups or whatever, you don't actually end up talking about Bitcoin all that much. What you end up talking about is like stuff like carnivory or vaccines or like just other stuff like a lot of people discuss Christianity with me, I guess perhaps because I'm like kind of a prominent Christian Bitcoiner. But a lot of people are just kind of curious, and they asking questions about things that they've been told because they've been lied to about money. They realize that Bitcoin is very different, and they have to sort of like reorient their brain around like the truth. So they start doing that for other things, and you get into long conversations about like, okay, like maybe traditional marriage is good. Like we should think about things in a certain way, and having children is good and not like a burden or whatever. So you end up talking a lot about that in a lot of these conferences, and that's what I've noticed.
That's interesting. If you're all right with diving into this topic, I actually didn't
Mhm.
know that you were religious or at least vocal about your faith.
Mhm.
So, can you maybe touch on how being a practicing Christian, a vocal Christian in this space plays out? How does your faith intertwine with sort of your Bitcoin beliefs?
Yeah, so I've told people that Bitcoin has taught me to be a better Christian. It's kind of a strange thing to say, but I think it's true
I'm
because
very curious about this. If you could kind of maybe just go a little deeper about that.
yeah. So the reason I say that is I think when I was working in the fiat world, right, like working for a corporation or whatever, I didn't realize, but a lot of my beliefs were sort of motivated by the salary I was making at whatever company. So I would naturally want to defend the company, and really it's an extension of the salary I was making. So I wasn't thinking that clearly. And I think a lot of people find themselves in that when they're working for a giant corporation or the government or something like that. They have a certain set of beliefs, and they haven't examined them in depth. I think 2017, when I went off on my own and started my own business, like I started questioning a lot of that stuff. And I became a lot more, I guess, what they would call online, like more toxic, right? Like just I was fine sort of saying stuff that was controversial, and for me that was like a big step for me in my faith, in the sense that I think I've always been taught, I guess, from cultural Christianity, that you have to be nice.
Right.
But that's like, if you actually read the Bible, like you see how Jesus actually talks to a lot of people, especially people that are very arrogant, have no humility, and think that they know everything. Like he's actually very harsh with them. You brood of vipers, you whitewashed tombs, you know, who taught you that you were, you know, going, you were headed for destruction and stuff like that. And being sort of like committed to truth, I think is a lot of that I learned through Bitcoin, through having, well, more like getting out of fiat than being in Bitcoin, I guess, is like not having your beliefs tied to your job or your salary, but rather just like examining them from first principles. So that's one obvious sort of like cross point between Christianity and Bitcoin, is that Bitcoin has helped me to be a lot more bold about my faith, and just like sort of mentioning it to you like I am right now. It's not a problem for me. I'm not fearing getting canceled or anything, because in a sense I've tried to make my life uncancelable, right? Like whoever cancels me, that's fine. I have different streams of income. If you don't want to do business with me, yeah, that's gonna suck, but that's okay.
I was just going to say that I wasn't aware that you're a religious individual or practicing Christian, but that makes total sense. I'm a believer myself. You
Hmm.
know, not that vocal about it. I mean, this podcast, we talk about citizenship and residency by investment and Bitcoin. I haven't really gotten into any religious conversations. The topic hasn't come up, but I'm always happy to talk about it and give, when the moment presents itself, have a conversation about it. That's really interesting. I just hadn't ever really thought about how Bitcoin plays into religion of any kind, but I can definitely see sort of the ethos of what you're saying about how doing what is right and doing the right thing, that sort of thing. I'll just share something personal. I got sober 13 months ago. 13 months and 2 days been sober. I have learned through recovery that really life is about growing up, doing the right thing. Do what you say what you do, that kind of thing. And a lot of those, I think, what the cypherpunks were really hitting on, is ingrained in the early Bitcoin ideology. And I think a lot of those sort of things that Satoshi hit on, or at least alluded to, not directly, but they're implied in the white paper. I think a lot of those values that he was basically trying to kind of bring up and say, like, hey, look, you guys, governments, have screwed around with our monetary system for years and years, and we've put up with it. So here's a new system that we're putting out to essentially take back control, permissionless peer-to-peer financial transactions, and we don't need your permission. But that's a very interesting angle on it, and I hadn't thought about it. So it's refreshing to always hear new points of views on Bitcoin, or how life lessons, sort of these lessons that I think have been mm, not dismissed, but this idea of, like, men are men, and that's biology, right? Like, I'm sorry if that's offensive. Why the hell are we putting tampons in the boys' locker room in high school? Like, what are you talking about? These sort of insane ideas that have sort of permeated into society. And I feel like I'm going on a jag here, so I'll try to bring it back to the interview. But yeah, I definitely think that there's a lot of ethical things that people don't really think about that Bitcoin brings to the table when it comes to these other areas of life that you're alluding to. So it's refreshing to hear that.
Well, I mean, you should read the book. Thank God for Bitcoin. We make that
I-
moral Christian case, and I've spoken a lot about it. We have a lunch right before the Las Vegas conference. I think May 27th. So if you want to meet other Christians that are into Bitcoin, that's the place to go. And I'll be speaking at it. So yeah, check that out if you're interested. The other thing that I thought of with regard to sort of like the parallels with Bitcoin and Christianity is that at least with like Christianity, the strategy that's worked for me, and I'm not saying this is the truth for everybody, is you could like try to go and talk to people about Christ, like just like whoever you meet, try to
Mhm.
sort of proselytize very aggressively. That generally doesn't turn out that well. What I found is that I make it clear to people that are around me, hey, I am a Christian, right? And
Mhm.
I'll throw it into random pieces of conversation or whatever we're talking about, just hey, like this is what we did at church last week or whatever, just to let them know. And if they have questions, they'll like maybe ask me later,
Mhm.
or say something. And I found that the same sort of strategy works with Bitcoin as well. It's very easy to like get into a mode where you feel like you have to go and tell everybody about Bitcoin, but not everyone is necessarily receptive to it. The strategy
Right.
that's worked for me is to let everyone know that I'm a Bitcoiner. And if they're
Right.
interested, come talk to me, right? They know that I'm done a lot of stuff in it. So if they're particularly curious, yeah, like email me, whatever. It's like, hey, let's go get dinner or whatever. And I think that's that is, like however you do Bitcoin related things or Christianity related things, like it's kind of similar in that way. The strategy tends to work a little better. I found a lot of my Christian friends asking me about Bitcoin, and I've also seen a lot of my Bitcoin friends asking me about Christianity, and that's worked for me. It's something that if you are a Christian or a Bitcoiner or both, it's a strategy worth trying out.
Yeah, absolutely. I can definitely see where there's many overlapping values for that. So yeah, that makes perfect sense that you can sort of maybe take these two ideas that are very congruent, but don't necessarily wouldn't necessarily be juxtaposed against one another from a natural mindset. I wanted to get into scaling. This is
Mm.
one thing that I've been thinking about recently, and a lot of it has to do with the last halving, and layer two, predominantly the Lightning Network, has always been touted out as this is how we're going to have hyper Bitcoinization, that this is how we're going to have global adoption of Bitcoin. But you had kind of alluded to or hinted at you don't necessarily maybe see that, because you mentioned, not everyone will run their own home node, something like that. And you had also hinted about cryptography, also, maybe how quantum computing kind of factors into the future of Bitcoin. I realize that's kind of a loaded question and we can kind of break that out. But just from a scaling standpoint, how do you see layer two being implemented on a larger scale?
Yeah, that's really more a market question, and it's almost always impossible to predict what the market will do. But what we have so far is Lightning, and Lightning works really well. Especially compared to like 2018, 2019. Nowadays, you go to a Bitcoin conference, almost everybody takes Lightning, and it's almost instant. I'll sell books at like at a conference, and I'll most like there's a bunch of people that'll want to pay cash or credit card or whatever. And that's about half. Another half that wants to pay with Lightning. I very rarely get on-chain payments for small amounts like that anymore, and that's a very good thing. Maybe once every other conference, I'll get like somebody that wants to pay on chain because they don't know about like Lightning or something like that. But that's a reality that we live in today. That's not to say that that's going to be the reality in the future. There's a lot of different and interesting sort of layer twos that are coming along. You have Arc, you have state chains, you have eCash and like Liquid and things like that. Who knows what what becomes popular, which user experience is the best, or what gets what captures people's imagination, or they do something that didn't expect or something like that. Who knows, right? Like, and
Right.
that's kind of the beauty of it, is that there are a lot of different systems that you can build on top of it. And depending on the use case, it might actually make sense to use some of those. So I like, all that's to say, I don't really know,
Right.
but like which L2 is going to win out, or, how they're going to interoperate or whatever. But I do think that, like asking everybody to custody their own coins might be unrealistic, as much as I would like that to happen. Like, if you're 85 years old and have dementia, you really shouldn't be possessing your own coins, right? Like, there should be something. And this is why I've been working on this project of doing like a family bank kind of thing for Bitcoin, where one trusted person, somebody that's technically competent, has like a multi-sig setup, and anybody that wants to, like keep money with that person that they personally know, that's a different situation than, a faceless corporation or something like that, and less liable. So I'm hoping that that's part of the solution for the future, and maybe like if there's a lot of uptake on something like that, then the technically competent user can actually like open Lightning channels and run Lightning nodes and give access to Bitcoin that can be spent at conferences, or like El Salvador or something like that. So ideally, that's the direction that it goes in. Again, I don't know. We might end up in a world where Visa decides, okay, we're going to adopt Bitcoin as one of the 37 currencies that we
Mhm.
support, and you just have a Visa card that like pays in Bitcoin, and they take their 3%, and maybe that's easier for merchants to use. I
Mhm.
don't know, but that's it. Like, the future is open, and we don't really know, and it really depends on how people react to it, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. What are your thoughts about quantum computing? Because, like, you keep hearing these rumors. This is
Mhm.
not my expertise whatsoever. This is all just, I don't know how much of this is fear mongering or if it's actually real, but someone will release a news report or something about, like, oh, quantum computing in X amount of years, they might be able to break, SHA 256, that sort of thing. I'm just curious, do you see that as a reality? Where does quantum computing fit in? Is it something to be scared of or just sort of a nothing burger?
Well, I'm gonna give you my opinion. I think quantum computing is like climate change. It's a big nothing burger, and it's being used by a bunch of people to scare certain people. If you actually study how it all works, it's really complicated, first of all, and
Mhm.
the amount of data that you're able to look at, just because of how quantum stuff works, is that once you look at something, then everything else sort of like freezes in that thing. And it's not sort of like the popular conception, which is that you can do exponential calculations in linear time or something like that. That's not how it works. It's, you get to make one observation, and that observation, if you use like a Fourier transform and look at these quantum gates in a particular way, then you can get maybe like a square speed up on a particular kind of thing. Generally the whole thing is pretty much not possible, right? Like, at least that's my opinion. At least with something like cold fusion, you can sort of figure out, okay, there may be a way to do it. Although you ask any like high level physicists, they're like, it's not happening in the next 50 years, right? And cold fusion has been something that they've been hyping for since like the 80s, basically. So it's been what, like 45 years or something like that. And
I
quantum's very similar, nanotech's very similar. There's something about new technologies that a lot of people want to hype, particularly like tech writers at like magazines and stuff like that. They always want to make it sound like it's something that's coming down the pike. When in reality, we've actually not made that much technical process since 1971 in almost anything. I mean, I'll grant you like computers and things like that.
Mhm.
That's mostly making things faster that we already know how to build.
Mhm.
Something like quantum, nanotech, cold fusion, stuff like that. It's all stuff that we don't know how to do. And
If
you
I can
can't.
interject real quick, just because I'll be honest, you hit on something like a minute ago, and it kind of went over my head a little bit. Let's maybe just in layman's terms define what quantum computing is, because I realize maybe we brought up this term and listeners don't know what it is.
Yeah,
So
that's kind of the problem, right? Most people think they know what it is because they've read a Google press release from their, like the quantum lab or whatever. Like just look at the incentives, guys. Like
right,
if you're the head of the Google quantum computing division and you don't put out a press release like that for 5 years, you're going to get fired and your whole division eliminated because it's a giant cost center. You have to make it sound like you're doing something actually interesting, or you're at the verge on the verge of a breakthrough or whatever. But what I can tell you is that first of all, whatever they did, it's almost impossible to verify, right?
of
The
course,
the
because
claim is that they
it's proprietary. They can't explain how they did it.
or, I mean, we can't even verify that what they did was actually proper, right? Because the thing that they said that they did is it would take a conventional computer like 10 to the sixth years to go and do. Well, but in order to verify that they actually got it right, you have to actually use a classical computer to go and verify it. So we have no idea if they got the problem right or whatever, and it's essentially like a giant number, random number generator, which honestly a quantum computer should be able to do, given that that's the one property of quantum mechanics that you can be assured of is that it's pretty much random. But quantum computing is this idea that Richard Feynman, I think in the 80s, like sort of expounded on. But like we really haven't made any progress. Like they'll
Okay.
talk about like the number of qubits as if like, okay, yeah, this chip does like 40 qubits, or this chip does 5 qubits and whatever, as if those numbers mean anything. Actually, we don't have one functional qubit
I don't
like
even know
in
what a
anything.
qubit.
Yeah, it's the quantum equivalent of a classical computer bit. A bit is a 0 or 1, right? A quantum bit, a qubit, if you will, is something that isn't a 0 or 1. It has some like state in between. It's just a bunch of states. Now, we have no idea how to get anything in those states like to start, right? Like we don't know how to do that. Like with anything quantum, like you can sort of manipulate things a little bit, but not really. And then there's like decay and stuff like that. So you have to error correct in case it decays, and it gets to be a very thorny and difficult problem, which is why they haven't made any progress since the 80s basically. So like
Okay.
all of these labs and stuff like that, they have to
Mhm.
continue to justify their funding, so they'll always claim to be sort of on the verge of a breakthrough. And this is how fiat things work: is you have to make it seem like you're on the verge of something great, otherwise you're going to have like, your funding cut off. So like climate change, for example, that's another one where like you depend on grants, so you have to make things sound like urgent or dire, or you have to relate like what squirrels are eating to somehow climate change so you can get funding or something. It's just all sorts of weird, distorted incentives all over academia. This is another like string theory, for example, like has no
Mhm.
evidence for it whatsoever. There's like a multitude of different string theories that you can't prove or disprove. It's not science. But because there's like a bunch of PhDs that this was their dissertation, this is what they've been publishing for like the last 30 years, the field doesn't go away. And that's it's unfortunate, but this is sort of like the bureaucratic momentum of fiat money, is that the people that are in charge get to decide a lot of this stuff. And rather than saying, okay, this is completely unpromising, let's just drop it and do something else. Well, there's already a lot of money poured into quantum, so we have to do something, right? Like in our own industry, we saw this with like blockchain. Oh, we can use blockchain to do this, blockchain to do that. It pissed me off so much that so many like sci-fi writers were like putting this into their novels, and it's like, doesn't make any sense, right? They don't understand anything of a blockchain, but they make it sound futuristic by saying, okay, like our identification data is in some blockchain, and that's how it's like. You're just listening to stupid VCs that are so gullible that they'll believe anything about any technology and think that sci-fi novels are like a good indicator of what the future will bring. And it's like that's not the case.
I think a lot of it was someone trying to sell someone like, hey, if we put it on the blockchain, you won't have to worry about it. I think a lot of what AI is doing is great, but people have this idea that AI is somehow going to completely automate their life 100%. And I mean, maybe this is me being a little dystopian, but I mean, there is kind of that fear that humanity ends up like the giant blobs from Wall-E, and we're just living on a spaceship perpetually out in outer space and pressing a button for our robot to come. But I actually wanted to bring it back to quantum computing if I could. This is the way that it was explained to me from a very layman's standpoint, and you tell me if this is accurate or not. If you're trying to guess a password, for example, you enter a string of characters, numbers, one by one, character by character. Essentially, what quantum computing is basically pressing all the buttons at the same time.
Not
And
right.
no?
That's not it. That's a popular misconception that you can do exponential stuff in linear time, and it is not that. It is specifically not that. And anyone that works in quantum, like this is the first thing that they have to tell everybody is that that's not how it works. It's not like you're getting to try 100 different buttons at once. There are particular speed ups on certain algorithms, mostly like something known as Shor's algorithm that people point to, but that's not how it works. And this is where sort of like sci-fi minds like go sort of way too far in thinking that they understand it. That's not the reality. And any actual quantum physicist or anyone that actually like works in quantum computing will tell you that's not, now it's beneficial from like sort of like a public narrative standpoint to make it seem like that, but that's not the case. It's very far from reality. But anyway, that's a popular conception though, so a lot of VCs think that way and will go and fund like quantum computing companies not knowing anything about quantum mechanics or the actual equations at play or what you're actually observing and all the different problems and challenges that are related to it. But this what I'm talking about with like fiat stuff is that you get a momentum because of the money on certain things, even if they're completely false. If they're completely useless, it doesn't matter because a certain type of person will keep funding it, and like the grift keeps going because fiat money funds it. Yeah, I mean, it pisses me off so much because so many people
I can tell.
have that, and like they think they know something, and it's especially bad among people that are just smart enough, right? It's like that midwit meme, right? Like they're in the middle part of the bell curve, and and they think they understand Bitcoin because they read like TechCrunch article or something like that, or they think they understand quantum because they read like a popular article on it. They haven't actually looked at the literature or like anything that the actual scientists look at. They just think they understand it because they saw like a documentary or something. And it's like that stuff is just so dumbed down. You have no idea how much you're getting manipulated by this stuff right now. And that's the case for almost all of science, honestly. It's so much of it is just fiat science. It's just going off in directions that are completely unfruitful, but they go into it because the money is there. It's a very distressing sort of like thing when you think about all the money that's just getting wasted on that stuff, on useless research just because it fits somebody's political agenda. But that's basically what it is.
Yeah, there's definitely plenty of examples of that, and probably there were a lot that were uncovered during COVID. And I think not to get too into that, but since you hit on it, I'm wondering what are some geopolitical factors that you think are going to most impact Bitcoin's evolution, maybe in the next 5 years? And again, I know a lot of this is speculation, but maybe instead of projecting it out that far, what are some geopolitical factors maybe that you think today that are either benefiting or possibly hindering Bitcoin's acceptance, growth, adoption on a larger scale?
I mean, the obvious answer I think is something like user experience or something like that. I hit on this point earlier, but I think a lot of people are just kind of scared to possess their own stuff, to have their instruments. I mean, imagine if you had like a 400-ounce gold bar in your house, you'd be like paranoid all the time about like having it stolen because it's worth so much money. That's kind of the situation that a lot of Bitcoiners find themselves, right? It's having a lot of that. That's a mental sort of like block. It's not that they're incapable necessarily. I think most people are pretty capable of being able to use a hardware wallet or maybe even multi-sig and stuff like that. It's that they don't want the responsibility. They've like the last 100 years or so in securities and stuff like that, everything's moved from bearer instruments to registered instruments, and for a reason, so that you don't have to worry about loss and things like that. But that brings about a lot of centralization and fragility, which I think we're a lot of that is coming home to roost, unfortunately. Getting to that different mentality is, I think, what's preventing a lot of people from getting into it. But that
Mhm.
said, there's enough inflation, there's enough hurt that's being spread around as a result of the monetary shenanigans of different countries and central banks that you're seeing a lot of people sort of coming in almost unwillingly, but having to because otherwise they can't really for better or for worse, that seems to be the way Bitcoin gets adopted. Is it's more by necessity than by desire.
What do you think about the current political landscape of Bitcoin these days? Like it was just yesterday, I believe, that they announced that both Donald Trump Jr. and Eric Trump are going to speak at this year's Bitcoin conference. If you look at Trump's stance on Bitcoin during the first administration, he was very anti Bitcoin and all of a sudden now seems to be, spoke at the conference in Nashville last year as candidate Trump, but now as president, you're definitely seeing a very pro Bitcoin approach. I'm just wondering from a political standpoint, what are some of the negative aspects of this? Because I definitely have my apprehensions about someone who's able to make that big of a U turn on something and perhaps maybe give them the benefit of the doubt that the individual was ill informed and possibly now is educated and has been orange pilled, that sort of thing. But it's just having a little distrust for these political figures that come out at the right moment. Like, where were you in 2023 when Bitcoin was down around 30K, something like that? You know, like you weren't hyping it up as much then as you are now when we're, almost hitting 100K. I'm just curious, what are your thoughts about the, political involvement in Bitcoin now?
Yeah, the reason why the Trump administration is now more pro Bitcoin is because he got a ton of money from Bitcoiners, right? And actually, it wasn't really Bitcoiners. He got ton of money from crypto people, right? It
Mhm.
was, I know for a fact that the Winklevoss twins like gave him a ton of money, and a lot of other people like the Coinbases of the world gave him a lot of money. It was
Mhm.
actually a significant part of his the funds that came into his campaign came from like Bitcoin. So like that's why. Now the
Okay.
bad part about that is that he's shitcoining, right? Like by like a lot. He launched Trump coin, Melania coin and things like that. And he hasn't figured out yet what Bitcoin is all about. I
Right.
I thought when I was at the big Bitcoin conference in Nashville last year, when he spoke, like I was completely disappointed. I was like, he doesn't get it at all. Whereas like when RFK spoke, I was like, oh, okay, he actually gets it. He understands what Bitcoin is all about. And I felt like, okay, like one of us could have made the same speech that he made. But Trump just didn't get it at all. Like one line I remember that he said was, under my administration, Bitcoin went up 3,500%. It only went up 50% during Joe Biden's administration, as if he was like taking credit for Bitcoin's price appreciation. And he's like, I'm like, dude, you have no idea how this stuff works, and you're just sort of like making crap up. and and that was extremely disappointing because I was like, okay, there's obviously a lot of people giving him money. Like, hopefully he does at least a little bit of homework, but he seems completely captured by like the altcoiners basically. So that's the bad part about it. But that said, like there are people that understand Bitcoin. Senator Lummis being a major one. There's several others that are very much pro Bitcoin and not crypto. Get in Trump's ear a little bit more. I can see things getting a lot better, but at the moment, it's just there's a lot of shitcoining, and it's unfortunate, but yeah, it is what it is. I mean, like we were never really going to use politics as like a way to get Bitcoin adoption anyway. It's just like stop hurting us, like leave us alone kind of thing.
But I was gonna say, it's sort of the world we live in, right? Like, unless you want to just go live in a cave somewhere and just hodl forever, I mean, there's always this constant, and we can maybe get into this if you want, but I'm curious, what are your thoughts about living off of Bitcoin? There is sort of this camp of two thoughts. Like, you should obviously earn stack sats and never spend them, or the idea of having a circular Bitcoin economy, like what El Salvador has promoted, as being able to earn in Bitcoin and spend in Bitcoin. What are your thoughts on those two camps?
I mean, in my personal view, the much more strong use case for Bitcoin is store value, right? It's keeping it for the long term because every time you spend Bitcoin, you find out, okay, well, had I just used dollars instead way back when, like I would have done a lot better because you don't want to spend like an appreciating asset. That said, the point at which you start using it for payments is exactly when you are all in on Bitcoin, and I think that's the direction a lot of Bitcoiners are going into anyway. The idea being that once your wealth is in Bitcoin, well, you have no other choice. You're gonna go spend Bitcoin where it's one way or the other. And I think that's the natural evolution of things with respect to money. If you have any dollars left, you're going to want to spend that first, and that's great. I think people should do that because the you should be hoarding the good money and getting rid of the bad money. Like this sort of like almost like badgering, like Karen, like attitude from a lot of people on X or whatever. That's like, well, you have to use like a circular economy, blah blah blah. I think is just completely missing the point. If you're storing in Bitcoin, that's a natural consequence of not having any dollars to spend. But if you're just sort of badgering them and saying, well, you shouldn't keep the Bitcoin, you should spend it and or replace it with dollars or something like that. It's like that's a retarded way of using your Bitcoin as like a really bad credit card. Get Once you're at a point where that's your only choice, that's going to make a lot more sense economically anyways. Like that's what I'd say.
I'm curious about your take on this also. And I've just kind of recently, no one brought it up, but it just kind of came into my mind and I'm sure many, many other people are thinking the same thing, not claiming this is an original thought. But with strategy now having more than half a million Bitcoin, I think with their most recent purchase, I think they purchased 15,000 some odd Bitcoin the other day, and they're now at over 555,000 Bitcoin. And I'm just wondering, okay, from a corporate standpoint, you've got more than half a million Bitcoin on your balance sheet. What are you going to do with it? Like, it almost seems, you know, from a very pragmatic standpoint, like, this to me seems the opposite of what Satoshi would have wanted. A corporation that has gone around and leveraged its economical power to acquire more of this commodity and then just hoard it. And I say hoard, not hodl, because I feel like that's kind of the direction they're going. Maybe there's a little bit of jealousy in there also for having that much Bitcoin. But what are your thoughts about these corporations? And we can kind of leave the ETFs out of this, but what are your thoughts about these larger corporations, strategy, Meta Planets, these people who are getting into Bitcoin and buying, tens of thousands of it at one go.
Yeah, I mean, I get what they're doing. Essentially, what they're doing is using the infinite money glitch, as they say. They have access to a lot of debt, and they're using that to leverage up their Bitcoin. Now, I'm kind of skeptical of leverage because once it goes south, then you can blow up, and you want to make sure you don't blow up. Like the one of the rules of Bitcoin, I think, should be, just keep some, don't blow up, right? Like, and this is why I say don't borrow to go buy Bitcoin and stuff like that. Unfortunately, it's less available to retail. I mean, actually, it is available to retail. That's a way in which a lot of people go, you know, end up with zero Bitcoin. For a corporation, the way I see it is what they're doing is they're taking a lot of this fiat stock market bubble and sort of Bitcoinizing it. So a significant amount of wealth is in the stock market, not because they're so interested in what the companies are doing. It's because there's no other real store of value. And
Mm.
there's no real juice to be earned out of the stock market. Dividends more or less stopped a long time ago. Very few companies actually give them out. That used to be the reason why you would buy a stock, was for the dividend, and it used to be priced accordingly based on here, bond pays this much, dividend should pay about this much, and there's this risk and all that. That's how it should be. But that's stock market has long abandoned that because of the flood of fiat money that's essentially come into it. Well, what MicroStrategy, MetaPlanet, 21, all of these companies, what they're doing is they're injecting Bitcoin into this because the returns are way better. The asset underneath is a lot more solid. So what they're able to do is give everybody better returns, right? And even like Pierre Rochard's new company, the whole idea is to give different levels of risk to different players based on Bitcoin. And for example, the bondholder can get like 3 or 4% consistently versus somebody that's getting a little more risk. It might go down some years, but up more years and stuff like that. Ultimately, like what all of this does is it sort of undermines fiat, right? It brings a lot of that into the Bitcoin system, and it transitions the stock market away from this very fragile fiat money based thing to a more Bitcoin based thing. MicroStrategy is one of the most traded stocks, options, ETFs, you name it. Like they're just traded everywhere for a lot of stuff. Like there are people in Korea right now that are looking at MicroStrategy stock because it's so volatile. And so a lot of that money is actually, I think, going where it should be, which is Bitcoin. And essentially what MicroStrategy and all these other companies do is give a lot of vehicles for this money to flow in. Now, is that necessarily great? I mean, maybe not, right? But like it's a permissionless system. You can't like complain about somebody doing something that you might disagree with because it's their money, right? Like they can do whatever they want. And if they manage to go get a lot of Bitcoin, I mean, what are you going to do? Like, say, go talk to the CEO of Bitcoin. Hey, don't let them this money. That's not how it works. So for me, what they're doing is rational, economical, and in many ways, it makes the stock market less liable to a sudden crash, which I think is kind of inevitable in many ways because of the fragility of fiat money. Yeah, like live and let live. Like it's okay if MicroStrategy has 500,000 Bitcoin. Who knows if they get taken over and like the Bitcoin gets used for nefarious purposes or for good purposes. I don't. And like that's just life. Like not everyone's going to use it in the way that you think is best, but it's also not yours, so it's not your place to tell them what to do.
Fair enough. That's a very stoic answer, but very accurate. I will definitely agree. Free market, absolutely. They can acquire as much Bitcoin as people are willing to sell. I did just kind of want to wrap this up and just try to be respectful of time. We had, in the beginning, we talked about how you got introduced to Bitcoin through coding, taking that up when you were younger. Where do you necessarily see the role of Bitcoin education and maybe dev development or education in general about Bitcoin that could be applied to the general public in the coming years. My first thought of this is maybe like what El Salvador is doing with my first Bitcoin, meaning actually having classroom instruction about the economics behind Bitcoin. But what are your takes on what direction could either education or development go to bring awareness about Bitcoin to the public?
Yeah, so I think that's kind of the wrong frame for me because, in a sense, like the whole idea of public education, I think, is completely off, right? The main way it happens is that it's kind of like you push these ideas into these kids and hope it sticks or whatever. And what you find is that a lot of kids aren't interested, and it's torture for them, right? To learn stuff that they don't really want to learn, and then maybe you have to dangle some carrots in front of them. Hey, if you do good here, then you can get into a good college, and if you get into a good college, you can maybe get into a good grad school, and if you get into a good grad school, then you can have like a nice job making this much money or whatever. And it's I don't think that's a natural way people learn things. The way people learn things is because they're curious about it, and without that innate curiosity or some level of internal drive to learn something, I don't think any of that really sticks that well. And that's my personal opinion. I've observed it teaching people and stuff like that. And it's a very different thing to be teaching in a university classroom, which I've done, versus like teaching people that are paying you money because they really want to learn Bitcoin. That shows significant internal drive. And it's very obvious to me when I see that the latter people are the people that you should be catering towards and not the former people, right? That the people that are just sort of doing it for the grade or whatever. So for me, the resources are already out there. I think there's a lot of different books and stuff like that. What you can't do is force people to go learn that stuff. And I'm a libertarian. I think Christ gave us liberty. I think those are all good things to sort of subvert that by saying, hey, you now have to go learn this because, I'm going to force you to over, have this much time or whatever. It doesn't work. And I don't think it's really ever worked. It's just sort of like, it's ineffective. It's immoral in many ways. And, I like, the resources are out there, great for the people that are creating them and everything. But, this idea of like push education instead of pull education, where, it's, you take people's internal drive into account and so on. There's plenty of resources. I think anyone that wants to learn about Bitcoin can, and by reading like maybe a couple of books and watching like 3 YouTube videos, you're going to have a pretty decent understanding. To like force people that don't want to learn this stuff, I don't think that's a good idea.
I can definitely see the case for maybe moving away from less government regulation of education and allowing for more parental control, that sort of thing. But that's a whole other topic we could get into. If you were to propose, let's say, major upgrade or one change to Bitcoin that could have a dramatic effect on it, what would be something that you would ideally want to see either implemented from a policy side or from a coding side that could maybe allow for perhaps more scalability, something along those lines?
Yeah, I actually think it would be better if the Bitcoin protocol ossified right now and we didn't add any changes. The thing about any of these changes or whatever is that it sets back development because you have a changing landscape.
Mhm.
If the whole thing were ossified and there were like sort of there was a fixed field of things that you knew where everything was, then people can build around it. But as long as there's like a possibility of something changing, then it makes it harder to build on. And I can attest to this from personal experience. I've wanted to teach Lightning for many years, but the protocol keeps changing. And that makes it very difficult to teach because, okay, well, now we have Schnorr signatures and we're going to use music to open new channels. Okay, then all of the material that I did to show how to make these other non-taproot channels are completely void, right? Like, and like, who wants to do that, right? If your teaching material is only going to last like a couple of years, it's not really worth it unless there's like an enormous demand or something like that. So I think it would be better actually to not have any new features and to just sort of completely ossify the protocol.
I think this was exactly because I saw the talk you gave in El Salvador.
Mhm.
This was exactly the topic that you hit on, correct? The ossification of Bitcoin, right?
Yeah. So that was the debate I had with Jameson Lopp, and I think it would be better if we ossified rather than getting in this new feature or that new feature, because like developers like that, right? Like having more primitives to work with, more ways to do things, and it can be creative and stuff. But it sets the rest of the ecosystem back because now you have to adjust to new things, and it's honestly a lot easier and a lot better to harden the things that have already been there, and we know these things work, instead of constantly giving them new stuff. It's a little bit of catering too much to developers, in my view.
Well, okay, so this is always a question that I have in my mind, right? So we're working with a protocol that's 16 years old, right? Obviously, technology evolves, sometimes rapidly, sometimes stagnates, but always evolves, right? I mean, with Lightning, it offers, great settlement, that sort of thing. But if you're doing it on chain, what do you say to people who are like, what do you mean I have to wait maybe an hour for my transaction to be settled? Something like that. There is sort of this counter argument, and I'm just playing devil's advocate here. Not a coder, not a programmer. I really am just talking about on a pragmatic use case, on a use basis. How do you kind of make that argument for not innovating?
Well, it's not that you don't have innovation. There's plenty of innovation. They're just on other layers. You have Lightning and Arc and BitVN and all this other stuff. There's plenty of this space to explore. It's just we don't want to do it at the protocol layer. There's a reason why TCP/IP hasn't changed very much since its beginning. There have been proposals for better TCP/IP, but they make a lot of logical sense. But then everyone has to upgrade, right? Like all the software around the world that connects to the internet in any way, shape, or form, and all these routers and everything, they would all have to upgrade to this new standard, and that's why we don't do it. That's personally what I think the protocol layer should be. It's not something it's not the layer for innovating. The layers for innovating are second layers and things like that, and it's plenty to do there. It's this idea that you can't have innovation unless it's at the protocol layer is stupid. It's just not true.
Like I said, not a programmer. This is why I ask the questions, to maybe just for my own edification or for the listeners. I just wanted to close out with just kind of final thoughts. What do you see looking forward, but in the near future, the next, let's say, 1 to 2 years? Is there anything where you definitely see like, hey, this is the avenue that Bitcoin should go, or we should definitely stay away from, this particular direction? If there's sort of something that you're optimistic about or pessimistic, the direction of Bitcoin in, let's say, maybe the financial system or in society, any particular direction that you would like to see it go or not go?
I mean, I'd like to see more decentralization in general. I don't like that GitHub is sort of like the place where all the core development happens. And for that matter, like BTCD and a lot of other clients tends to be more centralized. It's owned by Microsoft. I think we should get off of that. But I mean, overall, I'm a libertarian. I think the market will figure a lot of this stuff out, and just sort of like pushing for a particular direction or whatever. For me, a lot of that reeks of arrogance. It's thinking that you know better than the market what's going to happen. And for me, I'd rather just sort of watch and wait and see what's going on, and see if there are any opportunities and take advantage of those. But more or less, just sort of watch and learn. Like there's no like I'm not going to pretend that I'm like this expert at everything. So yeah, that's the way I approach it.
Yeah, it's definitely hard to predict the future, especially in something like crypto or Bitcoin, where the market is always changing and there's so many different input factors. I think what you said, just kind of watch and see what happens, is definitely a good approach to take. Just wanted to close it out. One last thing. Any words of wisdom, final thoughts about what we've discussed? Final thoughts for the listeners?
Yeah, go keep stacking, I guess, and learning about what's going on. I think my main message is, stay humble, right? Like
Mhm.
don't think that you know everything. Keep learning.
Very good. Absolutely. So this has been my interview with Jimmy Song, programmer and Bitcoin influencer. Jimmy, where can people find you if you want to plug any of your books or your Twitter handle?
I mean, you can find me on X at Jimmy Song, and I have a newsletter, jimmysong.substack.com. You can find all the information about me on those things.
Just want to say, Jimmy, thank you very much. This has been very educational. Definitely learned a few things that I did not know about all things Bitcoin. I really appreciate your time and thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thanks for listening to the Bitcoin Lawyer Podcast. For more information, please visit our website at www.bitcoinlawyer.com. And remember, Bitcoin Lawyer is your legal bridge between Bitcoin and freedom.